Welcome you all tonight to the first in a series of 4 conversations involving key players from the public and private sectors, architects, critics, Londoners, each with a different perspective on the burning issue of housing in London. My name's Joanna. I'm a planner and I'm a member of the Council of the AA, but I'm also a Londoner and I care passionately about the future of the city. In the week when the population of London exceeded the previous record of 8.615 million for the first time since 1939 and is forecast to rise to 11 million by 2050, the question of where we will live has never been more challenging. A recent London Council's report concluded that 810,000 new homes will need to be built in Greater London by 2021 to meet not only new demand but also the backlog of need. What London needs is obviously more homes. Of that, there's no doubt. Yet this is a much repeated truism obscures the difficult questions of how and where to get the capital building and how to make new homes affordable for Londoners. The challenge is not only in the number, but also how to deliver housing that will meet the needs of Londoners across the spectrum, from young people challenged by affordability and an ageing population in need of more specialised housing. We have to ask the questions: are we building the right types of housing that London needs? Do we need to look at more innovative types of housing? Do we have to build at ever-increasing densities with all the issues that might bring? Are we faced with an exodus of young professionals? And what will the impact be on the London economy if those people can't afford to find the housing they need? Over the next 4 weeks, culminating in an open jury on 6th of March, we'll start to answer those questions, hopefully, contributing not only to the housing debate, which is ongoing, but also, we hope, to some of the solutions. Our first conversation tonight is going to focus on the topic public versus private. Who will provide the housing London needs? And we're very pleased to welcome representatives from across the public, private and voluntary sectors tonight, all of whom are tackling in some way the housing issues facing London. Firstly, Peter Jefferys. Peter's a policy officer at Shelter. In autumn 2014, he project managed Shelter's entry into the Wolfson Economics Prize. This year, the prize asked for the design of a new garden city that was visionary, economically viable and popular. Shelter was runner-up out of 350 entrants for that prize. The design was developed in partnership with PRP Architects and with advice from KPMG, Legal & General and Lang O'Rourke. That proposal is still ongoing and hopefully one day we might see it on the ground. Through 2013 and 2014, he managed a joint project between Shelter and KPMG to develop a programme for the 2015 government to build the homes we need. Ben Denton. Ben is Executive Director for Growth, Planning and Housing at Westminster City Council, with a very wide portfolio, including development planning, strategic transport infrastructure, homelessness, housing management, affordable housing, funding and delivery, rough sleeping, housing management, projects, major projects and special projects delivery. I don't know how you managed to do all of that. Ben, interesting, was previously a director of First Space, delivering innovatively designed and award-winning housing in partnership with both the public and private sector. So it's a very interesting perspective I think Ben can bring on that. He's also a board member of the Thames Valley Housing Association and the Dolphin Square Foundation. Martyn Evans. Martyn's Marketing and Creative Director of Cathedral, one of the most exciting, innovative and forward-thinking developers working in the UK and particularly in London. Cathedral, if people aren't familiar with their work, seek to create and develop the kind of places and communities with a vibrant economic and social future, to turn around what you describe as lost pockets of London and the South East and put broken places back together again, creating jobs and homes and a sense of well-being. To quote, value not just for us, but lasting value for local economies, communities and businesses. We call ourselves agents of socio-economic change. And then finally, Eleanor Dodman, who probably a lot of you know. Eleanor graduated from the AA in 2014, and whilst at the AA, she was student editor of Architecture, the school's triennial newsletter. She served on council for 2 years and as the honorary librarian. And in 2014, she was awarded the AA Prize for significant contributions to the school. Her work's been exhibited at the Royal Academy, and she's currently working with Wilkinson Eyre Architects. We're going to start this evening by asking each of our speakers to give us their key headlines. I've set them a challenge to say, set their 5 key ideas for addressing London's housing issue. When we've heard them, I'll open up the discussion to the floor so you can ask questions. And let's really try and get the discussion going and try and get some positive outcomes from this evening. So thank you. So Peter, I'll let you begin.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to see so many people coming out to talk about such an important issue of housing in London. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the context of housing in London and how Shelter sees it, and then give you my 5 ideas for how we can tackle the housing shortage in London. So first of all, this is the big picture. This is the last 10 or 15 years in the capital, and it's people, jobs and homes. And hopefully what you can see from all angles is that London is growing in terms of its population. It's, in fact, 100,000 new people join the city every year. And it's also very good at creating jobs. Out of the recession in 2007, 2008, the jobs market bounced back incredibly strongly, as you can see there. What London's not good at doing is providing homes for those people that are moving to London and working in London. You can see that across the last 10 years or so, the gap between the number of people and the number of jobs and the number of homes has grown wider and wider. That's a cumulative graph, so every single year the gap is getting wider and it's getting worse and worse. The pressure is ratcheting up. So what are the impacts that we're seeing on the ground from this problem? Well, I think the main point I'd like to make really is this is now an issue that's affecting people right across society in London. So a statistic that Shelter put out just last week in a media campaign was that in London, to save the deposit for your first home, you'd have to save for 26 years. 20% of your salary for 26 years to save up a deposit on your first home in London. That's, it's impossible for most people. It's a huge amount of money. It's an impossible dream for too many young families. And at the same time, for families on the lowest incomes or no income, homelessness is becoming a huge problem, and it's a constant risk. Here I've got a figure across the UK. Every 11 minutes, another family finds themselves homeless. Actually, at Christmas in London this year, 60,000 children were in temporary accommodation in London this Christmas. Often sharing a room, entire family, sharing a bathroom with maybe 20 or 30 other people. It's not the kind of conditions that children should be living in. So this is an issue that's right across society in London. So how do we face up to that? How do we tackle this challenge? The first idea that I think is really important is the Mayor of London has a lot of power in housing already. He has a budget that's over £1 billion. He has all sorts of planning and strategic planning powers across the capital, and he should be using them more effectively. The really important issue in housing supply is the cost of land. In just the last year in London, land prices rose 25%. So we need to do something about that. We need to make sure that we can bring land in to build homes at lower prices. The Mayor has a power that can be used to tackle this. It's called development corporations. It's what we used to deliver the Olympic Park in Stratford. The Mayor's actually consulting at the moment on setting up another development corporation at Old Oak Common in West London. But this should be something that's happening on brownfield sites right across the capital. There's no reason why the Mayor shouldn't be using these powers, using his budget to crack on and get more homes built. And with the Olympic Park in particular, land was brought in at lower prices, which meant that some of the savings could be used to fund some of the infrastructure, for example. So development corporations, I think, are one way in which we can start getting more homes built with the infrastructure that they need too. The second idea, and you mentioned the issue of density. I do think London needs, in parts of the outer boroughs, places like Croydon, Bromley, Enfield, they are very low density at the moment compared to other world cities. London's actually extremely low density. If you look at density maps compared to places like Barcelona, London is incredibly low density compared to other European cities. And the way I think that we can tackle this is actually using TfL, Transport for London. The Mayor's recently announced that Transport for London is going to become a major property developer in the capital. His idea is basically TfL should build luxury flats, flog them off, and then reinvest that money into your trains and buses. Well, what we're saying at Shelter is the Mayor's also responsible for housing, not just transport. So use TfL to build affordable homes as well as luxury flats. We shouldn't just be using the land that TfL owns to build luxury flats to sell to foreign investors. We need to be housing Londoners with that land too. Just striking a better balance, really. Of course, it's got to raise some money for TfL to reinvest in transport, but you can also use that money to build affordable housing too. And the advantage of that sort of approach is you're building homes next to transport hubs. A lot of the land TfL owns is obviously around train stations and tube stations. So that is where you want to build homes if you're going to build at density, so people can commute. The third idea, I think this is really important, and this was in the press over the weekend actually, about how developers are negotiating away their affordable housing commitments. It's not just a numbers game, housing supply. It also matters, are we building homes that people can actually afford to live in? And the problem that we face at the moment is that developers are simply saying, it's not viable, we can't build these affordable homes, and government policy is such that they're getting away with it. And so what we need is for the Mayor and for national government to get a bit tough with developers and say, well, hang on a minute, if in 2005, 2006 you could build 20, 30% of the homes on this site as affordable homes, why are you now saying it's only 5%? What's changed? It was a bull market before the recession, it's a bull market now. There's no reason why you can't build these extra affordable homes. It's about getting a little bit tough. Actually, Ken Livingstone, the previous Mayor, his target was 50%. And now developers are saying, oh, we can't even do 10%. So, it is possible. We've just got to get a little bit tough with them, stand up to them, and get that affordable housing as part of new schemes. Obviously, this is Battersea Power Station, which is currently down at about 10-15% affordable housing, which is shocking for a huge new development right in the centre of London. There needs to be homes there that people on normal incomes can afford, not just luxury flats. The fourth idea, and this relates to the Wolfson Economics Prize that was raised earlier. I've called it people-powered growth, which sounds a bit woolly. But basically what I mean is we're going to have to expand London's boundaries somewhat. London's boundaries were set 30, 40 years ago, were underbounded. And some of the development, not all of it, I've mentioned density already, but some of the development we're going to have to do is going to have to be on the edge of London, with sustainable suburbs. The point I'd like to make about this is that the only way that you're going to make that happen is by winning people over, winning people's hearts and minds on the issue, because planning is political. Local people oppose development when it's not going to benefit them. They oppose development when the homes are unaffordable, when there's no local infrastructure, and when they can't see any chance of their kids ever benefiting from these new homes. So when we put forward proposals to grow London with garden cities or with new garden suburbs, they've got to clearly benefit local people. The image of everyone raising their hands there was when we designed this garden city. It's in Kent on the Hoo Peninsula in Medway, and we went several times down to Medway and spoke to local people and ran consultation events. And when you put it to them that the homes will be affordable for you and your children, there will be a new hospital, there'll be a new school, you're going to benefit from this development, they're quite willing to vote in favour of having large new development in their area. What they don't want is development that's not going to benefit them and their family, and is going to be completely unaffordable and put a burden on local services rather than add to local services. So I'd argue it is possible to grow London, but you've got to do it in a way that benefits local people and Londoners. One final point on this is we also put to them the idea of just giving them cash. So we just said, if we gave each of you £5,000 each, would you be more likely to accept this new garden city in your local area? And they hated it. They absolutely hated that idea. We actually had to take it off the table because they got really angry in the focus groups about the idea of being bribed. So it's not about just cost benefit in terms of cash. It's about building places that people want to live in and they can see benefit them, not just bribing them. Okay, so my final idea is that it's not all about building. At Shelter, our big campaign in the run-up to the general election is about we need to build more homes, but we also campaign on the private rented sector and trying to improve rights for renters. I'm sure many of you in the audience here are private renters, and you'll know about the unaffordable rents, the short contracts, the poor conditions. We need to have stronger rights for renters so that they can have decent homes. Too many renters are in homes that are of an unacceptable condition, and too many renters are being evicted for the wrong reasons. We also need to have a decent safety net for those who lose their jobs or fall ill. And at the moment, the safety net is being shredded, too many cuts to the safety net. And for Londoners in particular, it's going to become really a real struggle to be able to stay in a city like London, how expensive it is if you don't have a safety net that can catch you if you lose your job or you fall ill. So my final point is, as well as building more homes, let's have more rights for renters and let's make sure there's a decent safety net. Thanks very much.
Right, thanks, Joanna. I'll leave that off. So I haven't got a presentation, so straight from the heart. So as Joanna said, I'm Ben Denton, so I'm Executive Director of Growth, Planning and Housing. And it's interesting in this debate in that I have the local authority's responsibility for housing, homelessness, planning, property, and a few other bits and pieces that all link together in terms of housing and homelessness duties. So the points that have just been raised, I see on a daily basis. You know, particularly in the centre of a global city, where it's not just about not enough homes, it's about the implications of not enough homes. So really high levels of overcrowding within homes, real challenges when families have children and their children have no reasonable prospect of being able to live in the middle of London alongside their families. So you end up with either overcrowding or people having to move a long way away. So my 5 propositions for the evening are, first of all, in a slightly different area to the last presentation, is just remembering that local authorities do have housing powers. So the powers to intervene in the market, to properly plan the local area and to intervene. And local authorities have used those powers. They use those powers very extensively in the 50s and 60s, and really since the 70s have not significantly used those powers anymore. You are starting to see a lot more regeneration now, whether it's the regeneration in Westminster or Southwark or Brent. Lots of authorities are doing it, but it takes a long time and a lot of money and a lot of engagement with local people. And the challenge is, so we estimate in delivering a regeneration programme, it might take a year and a half, 2 years of consultation, 2 years of planning, 2 years of CPO, and then 4 or 5 years of building. So you can imagine, whenever you start to make a decision today, it's not until 10 years' time that you start to see an impact on the ground. And that means that absolutely we should be doing today what we need to do to be delivering outcomes in 10 years' time. But we need to deliver a lot more quickly than that. The second area is using financial capacity. So Westminster is a bit of an unusual authority. The property portfolio that I run has an open market value of well over £8 billion. We spend a lot of money on regenerating and delivering additional housing. So we spend probably £200 to £300 million a year of spend to deliver regeneration and deliver additional housing. But lots and lots of local authorities have unused financial capacity, or the public sector at large has unused financial capacity that it can use to drive growth and the delivery of additional housing. One thing that I think is worth really remembering, this is not just about affordable housing, it's about housing full stop. So local authorities do get fixated on affordable housing, but it's not just about affordable housing, it's all forms of housing. We need open market housing to fund affordable housing. So the issue is I think the public sector has been caught in maybe too much of just affordable housing, and now the focus has to be on all forms of housing and liberating financial capacity to deliver all forms of housing, which in turn will enable us to drive more affordable housing. The delivery can only be done with partners. I'm not just meaning about development partners and construction partners and financing partners, but also partners in terms of local residents. Some of the most successful schemes that we run are schemes where we stand back and say, this is your project, this is your opportunity. We as a local authority are just here to support you, help provide resources, provide input, and shape your local community. And we've got some fabulous examples where the local community have grabbed an idea, they love it, it's their future, it's their children's future, and they drive the process of change. That's really, really empowering. One of the more contentious issues, I think, the fifth issue is I think it's worth remembering that local authorities are legal constructs. You know, they are given artificial boundaries and then carved up into areas that are political environments. Yet a housing market is regional, sub-regional, or even part of a country now, given the distances that people need to travel. So in the past, local authorities have been involved in building housing outside their areas. Islington did it quite a few years ago. The City of London does it all the time. Indeed, their housing strategy is all about building outside the local area. I think it needs to become far more acceptable for local authorities to harness their financial resources to deliver housing outside their areas, just to start to liberate financial capacity to address some of the problems that we're exposed to. So I think this is a really, really challenging issue. It's a point that, it's an issue that lots of people constantly talk about, but I do think that the time now is to be bold and start to put in place some of those actions that maybe were not necessarily supportable in the past. Thanks.
Hello everybody, so I'm Martyn Evans. I'm a property developer. I'm the private sector, or part of the private sector roster for you to talk to you tonight about this very thorny subject. First thing I'm going to say is it's a really big, difficult, hard subject, and the biggest problem about it is that it's not going away anytime soon, as Ben said. This is a really long-term view that we have to take about this problem. In the 70 years since the war finished, both the government and the market has failed to tackle the problem of social and affordable housing delivery. And that's got us into the situation that Pete showed us in his graph there, particularly in London. All that's happened in that problem is that it's resulted in a demand and supply imbalance in the market that's done nothing but driven value of property up. And that has come to an acute point in various spikes in the market, and we're having one of those now. It's no wonder that foreign money is flooding into our city, because the demand for property is so huge, and if you've got money to invest in property, why would you not bring it to London and invest in that property? So you can't fight the market, particularly in a place like London. You've just got to find a way around it and do something about it to solve the problem that we have to solve. So what are we going to do? Are we going to put trade barriers in place to stop money coming from abroad into our schemes? Again, Ben made the point. It's about mixing social and private housing because the private housing sector is predominantly the deliverer of the funds and the wherewithal to produce the social housing. So what are we going to do? Stop that money coming in? I'd like to see pretty much any housing scheme in London get built if there wasn't some element, at least, of foreign money coming in to help that housing be built. So that's very difficult. It's just not realistic to say that that money coming in to fund private property development is going to go away or needs to go away. So what do we need to do? So here are my 5 things. Number 1, we need to encourage, as Ben said, a really broad mix of tenure and affordability across our property development. We have this crazy system at the minute that the majority of social housing, particularly in London, is being, if not delivered directly, but provided for by private housing sector through 106 contributions in large schemes, provided by social housing providers, provided by local authorities, but funded and delivered through Section 106 contributions of large private schemes. That system is fundamentally combative. It's about a property developer like me coming together with a local authority partner in a regulatory capacity predominantly, to have a fight. where the local authority is laying down the policy rules about levels of social housing that it requires, democratically decided, and me with my shareholders saying, utterly not viable, I need to protect my profits, and it's about a fight. How are we ever going to solve the problem when that is the situation that is delivering social housing? It's insane. And so there has to be some way in which that natural process is broken, is bucked. And it's about private sector taking more responsibility and understanding that everybody is going to lose unless we can sort this problem out. And it's about local authority and government trying to get around those rules and finding ways of delivering social housing that's not reliant on a fight between two completely opposing teams of people who have very different objectives. That's where the market is absolutely failing us in terms of providing enough social housing for people to afford and live in. The government has to take control of that. We've read in the paper in the last couple of days about the vacant building credit. I know that you didn't mention it particularly, Ben, but was it you quoted in the Guardian on Monday? Somebody, one of your colleagues,
one of my team,
one of your team, quite rightly complaining about the vast amount of resource that's just going to disappear from a local authority like Westminster if that policy continues to grow and become the norm of property developers. It's madness. It's complete madness. Number two, need to move on fast. Need to reform the green belt. That's a big issue for me. Much of London's green belt is not actually very green. It's more technically brownfield land. But green belt is such a massively political couple of words. I sat around a dinner table with the mayor. I was very lucky to do that last week. And I had a chance to ask him one question, and I asked him that. Why didn't he tackle the green belt? And he just looked at me, put his hands in front of my face and said, no, I'm not doing that. No. And I said, why? He said, oh, it's just too political, I can't, they won't let me, it's just impossible. And so when that is the result, hands in the face, don't even talk to me about that, that's a big problem for me, because there is an enormous amount of land, particularly obviously in the outer London boroughs ownership, that is not very green, that is former industrial land, that is designated as part of Greenbelt. We need to take a big, fat look at that. So I'd like to see a task force that might have some way of removing the politics from it. So it's not the mayor who has to decide to lead that conversation. There might just be some kind of research project that explains and identifies what's wrong with the Greenbelt and how we might find some land in it. Number three, we need a bigger focus on mixed-use communities. We have to encourage people like me, private sector developers, to care much, much more about the communities that they create. My business is about building complex mixed-use schemes where residential is usually the driving value in those schemes, in pockets of typically outer London boroughs, where we have to create mixed-use communities because that's the only thing that's going to work. Otherwise, you just create seas of residential property that really are not very nice places for people to live. And more property developers need to understand that if you make nice places with diverse communities that are enriched, wonderful places to live, values go up. It's just not true in the long term to say that if you just get in there quick, build, fund, get out, you win. It's just not true. So I would like property developers like my company to understand a bit better how to focus on more mixed-use communities and encourage people to care a little bit more about the places that they create. As a part of the private sector property development industry, I don't think we have a very strong voice in this issue. I think that a number of our trade professional bodies are failing us in terms of addressing those issues. So bodies like the British Property Federation, on one of whose committees I sit, RICS, there needs to be a lot more conversation among the REBA and RICS and British Property Federation to understand how we as an industry should be facing this, because we're only getting into trouble by not facing these issues and not finding ways around them, as evidenced by the articles in The Guardian at the beginning of this week. And it's bad for business. So there is a real incentive for my business to do something about it and find a way to be more constructive with this issue. And then there is the issue of the role of public land, as my final point. Local authorities in Britain are the largest, collectively the largest landowners in the country. About £170 billion worth of property in some, I mean, there are many ways of measuring it, but about that. That public land is available to help solve this problem. Local authorities have a choice. Government currently encouraging local authorities around the country to sell its land as quickly as it possibly can for maximum cash return to predominantly housing specialist developers to build housing units. But if we don't think more carefully about that, how we build not just houses, but the places where those houses need to sit, the communities, the more enriched communities where people are going to live and have happy lives and bring their children up, then we're going to be in trouble. So that's my final point, is that even though we need to up the number of units that we're building, up the proportion of social and affordable housing units that we're building, we have to be very, very careful about what we're building and how we're building them and where, and that we build sustainable, economically and socially cohesive places that have a sustainable future. Thank you.
So unfortunately, a number of my points have already been taken as the last. But what I'd like to say is, for my graduating project, I focused on actually people's perception towards housing. For example, the Green Belt. People think that the Green Belt is this lovely green, lush land all around England, and that isn't the case, as you said. So I think my first point would be that actually educating people as to what the difference between greenfield and green belt and brownfield sites actually are. And I think that also extends to things such as council estates, social housing, affordable housing. People, people don't necessarily want to live in places like this due to the perception that they've got given from the media, etc. My second point would be that actually people have proposed to the council to build their own houses and made collections and gone to the councils and have built many small pockets of housing themselves. And I think that self-building is another point that people don't really understand that they're able to do. And I think it's not necessarily just a public private question due to what I've said, but also how people's perception is involved in that. So it's a public, private and public sector question. I also think that it's not just about housing, but also the other infrastructure that goes with housing, such as schools, such as hospitals, GPs, etc., etc. That would be my third point. And I think that we also need to design for the future, and that although we need housing quickly, we have to make sure that it's the right housing, because it's not just going to be us living in it. As we've seen, we're still living in houses that were built many, many, many years ago. So we need to make sure that what we're designing is sort of adaptable for a future population, because it takes so long to build. Yeah, so those would be my thoughts.
Thank you very much. I think that's actually given us a really broad perspective. I think we could have taken the discussion on, but that's hopefully what we'll do over the next few weeks. But I want to open it up to the floor now, really, and if anybody has comments they want to add, if you've got your own ideas that you'd like to add to the debate, or any questions for our speakers. Anybody'd like to start? I think there's a lot of food for thought there that has come out of that. Some common themes, I think, that were coming out of that, about the need to be bold, to look at new approaches like self-build, to make better use of our assets, unlocking land, looking at creating places. It's not just about housing, but places as well. And the need to actually put people at the centre and take some of the conflict out of it. Anybody, any contributions they'd like to make? Just here, yes.
Hi. I was wondering if all of you could name an example of what is working now in London, whether it's public and private sector working together, or whether it's TfL understanding what they do, or the public sector understanding something better. What is good now? What can we learn from?
Wow, I mean, I think there's lots of different projects are completely different things. So, you know, a few years ago, I was sort of involved in funding the delivery of the Olympic Village, and I've got to say I haven't been back for a year or so. So it'd be interesting to see what it's like. But you look at something like that and think, you know, back to the point at the beginning, when everyone corrals together and decides to do something in a stupidly short time, they can actually, you know, deliver something quite quickly that's fairly. I'm sure it will have problems in future years, but you know, apparently people go down there and go, it is pretty, you know, pretty amazing, and it shows how it is possible for people to corral together, do something with a focus and an intensity and a drive. And it's worth remembering that before that, you know, before the games came along, of course, there were lots of agencies chatting to each other year after year about, wouldn't it be fabulous if we did something in this local area, but nothing happens. So I do think there is a massive issue about focus, about parties coming together, decide they're going to do something, do it within a time frame, and then move on, because otherwise you end up with too many projects, too many priorities, and you end up getting nothing done.
I've just come back from Manchester, where I went to see a development called Chimney Pot Park, which is quite old now. It's been, I don't know how old it is, 10?
Yeah,
10 years old?
15 years. Yeah.
More than 10, yeah. An urban splash development done by an architect's practice called Shed KM, who are from Liverpool. And I'd not seen it before, and I got a chance to go and have a wander around. I want to go in a couple of the houses and have a look. It's spectacular, absolutely spectacular scheme, and I urge you, if you all have not looked at it in detail, it is one of the best things I've ever seen. It's several rows of Coronation Street type houses in Salford that were all due for demolition. Hazel Blears got a bit grumpy about it and marched Urban Splash in and said, you've got to do something about this, and they did. They took them on. They completely transformed them, turning the houses upside down, and instead of the ginnels at the back, they raised that up a level so that the living rooms are on the first floor, leading out into a sort of terrace that runs all the way along the terrace, and underneath is the bin storage and the car parks. And it just completely flips an idea of Victorian back-to-back housing on its head and delivers something that's completely exciting and modern and fantastic. And it's utterly inspiring and a wonderful, wonderful place. And it has totally transformed and changed that neighbourhood, because the people who live in those houses are very happy about where they live. And that is surely what we all should be putting at the top of our list.
It's a really tough question for London. I think the Olympic Village is probably one of the best in recent years because of the public sector working with the private sector closely and having a development corporation and delivering that. So probably I'm going to slightly avoid your question and say the place to look is Germany and Holland, where they do sustainable urban extensions to their cities. In Holland in particular, in the 90s, it's called the Vinex programme. They built 100,000 new homes, which for the scale of Holland was pretty huge. And they did it all through urban extensions on the edge of existing towns. Really high design quality, really high environmental quality, and so local people wanted it. Germany as well, Freiburg is a really good example to look at, where they've built a large urban extension called Vauban, which actually is slightly odd in that they've banned cars. So it's a kind of like a weird sort of centre parks urban extension to a city, but local people really wanted it. The homes there are affordable for local people, and it's built at a much faster rate than developments in London or in the UK as well. One problem we often have is whenever we do propose a large scheme, it takes decades to build it. So if you look at places like Barking Riverside, in East London, it's been on, or Ebbsfleet Garden City is it now, as it's now trying to be. These are places that have been talked about for having new homes for decades, and they're not being built. In Germany and Holland, because they have a development corporation, because they put money behind it, because it's high quality, they get it built, and they get it built much faster than we do in the UK. So I think that's where we should look.
I think also what you said about France and Holland, but Germany and Holland, also in France, they use the councils use their pension funds in order to fund their housing, and I think that's something that we could look at doing in England, because it's always an excuse of money or land, and I think if you use the green belt that isn't so green and the pension fund money that we already have, those two problems become obsolete.
I think one I'd add to that as well, that Mayor's Planning Award last night, the Mayor's Award went to the regeneration of a council estate to integrate it more with the surrounding area. So I think it's again coming back to the point of actually making best use of existing resources, and that is a way of also addressing, I think, the issue that you've mentioned about the timescales that we need, because we've got an immediate problem, and you say that some of these bigger projects will take up to 10 years to deliver. Is what we do it here and now. Are there any other ideas with regards to dealing with that timescale lead-in issue?
Somebody mentioned density. Was it you? Density is obviously a way of speeding things up, because you build 3 times as many flats in one go in a place. You speed it all up. I was listening to somebody, one of the chief planner from New York, talk recently, who said that it made everybody around the table raise their eyebrows when he said that the population of New York and London are exactly the same, and yet New York is 4 times as dense as London. That's an extraordinary statistic. And that's about people like you encouraging clients to understand that density doesn't mean horrible. Density means great, fantastic, exciting places to live. I'm building in Brighton at the minute, and that's one of the biggest problems that we've got, trying to persuade, not the planners are fine, the people who have got very powerful objection voices, who have a big impact on the politicians and then the planners, about density in a city like Brighton. It's just absolutely impossible. And if we don't get over that and get away from that sense that density is horrible, density means grim, I'm being accused of building slums in Brighton, which is, it's just more insane than you could imagine. There we are.
I do think it's, it's a valid, we run, I run about 40 projects and about sort of a few sort of significant regeneration programmes. What's interesting is in each of our regeneration programmes, there's a lot of leaseholders. So the proportion of leaseholders are maybe 30-40%. So people whose homes are worth £300,000, £400,000, £500,000, £600,000, and you're going to them and saying, trust me, I'm the local authority, and we're going to knock down your home and build a better place. And so you can imagine the dialogue ends up being, being quite interesting. But when you do end up having a sophisticated discussion about, about design and architecture and the sense of what the future can look like, and it's, it's the beauty of design and the detailing of the place and the sort of uniqueness of the public realm that can integrate a place and can really work. It's, you start to see the passion of the local communities come out, and then people support the process of change. And then, interestingly, density becomes the enabler to deliver a much better outcome, as opposed to the concern that everyone was worried about. And the second issue is it's really important that you take people, take people elsewhere and say, look, is this really awful? This is what you've got at the moment. This is what we're aspiring to deliver. If it's really, really awful, put your hand up and say no, and we'll stop. We have a lot of votes in Westminster, so you vote for regeneration, which doesn't generally happen elsewhere, and it really means that you need, you need to have a really sophisticated dialogue with residents who are affected, who are uncertain. The future is uncertain, and they're not really sure what's happening. But it's enormously empowering as well when you say to residents, look, it's your choice. If you want, if you would like, this plan to be delivered, vote yes. And if you want to, if you don't want it to happen, vote no, and nothing will happen. And we've had a vote, a no vote recently, and it was very close. I mean, it was about, I think, 880 people voted, and it was 20 more people voted no than voted yes. And there was a massive no campaign as well, so, and we didn't vote, we didn't do a massive yes campaign, we just said it's your choice. So, perhaps we should have done a massive yes campaign, but there you go. But at the end of it, people then said, so we voted no, but is it going to happen? And we said, well, no, because people have voted no, so it's not going to happen. So there's an interesting sort of the psychology of places changing is I think is really, really interesting, helping people to see that cities do change, and if you want to live in a city like London, it's going to change over generations, and you need to be part of that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, fourth row back.
Hi, thank you so much. You talked about density. It's interesting that you brought up New York as an example. I'm not very familiar with London. I just got here, and for me, it's interesting to notice there's not that many high-rises here. And I was just always wondering, why is it? Is there any law, or is it like a social thing that people don't want to see high-rises?
Well, there is, I'll jump in and say there is a strange law in London about views of St Paul's, which apparently explains why we have like the Shard in one place and we don't have skyscrapers across the central London, because certain views of St Paul's from miles and miles away have to be protected. There's one from Richmond Park, which has got to be protected in particular. So there are some strange old planning laws. But I think generally it's probably a cultural thing. I don't know.
It's because we didn't do very well at it in the 1960s, and so we have a collective cultural memory of dense buildings being horrible. It's a lot to do with that, but it's also about old and new together. The scheme that I'm being just torn to shreds about in Brighton at the minute, the streets that I'm proposing are considerably wider than the very narrow streets where some of the people who are complaining live, and pay enormous amounts of money to live on tiny little cute windy streets in the city, but tiny little windy cute new streets are no good apparently. So it really is there's a lot of perception, there's a lot of old versus new, a lot of baggage from bad building that's causing it. Yeah.
I think there is. I mean, there is this I think a confusion between density and tall buildings, and the two are completely different issues.
Yes, that's right.
So of course it is possible to put fabulous tall buildings in places that where it's appropriate and where it adds to the skyline and helps to fill in the density. But of course putting a tall building on in lots of Westminster that would look over Buckingham Palace might have a few problems. So there are certain other places where it's a little bit more difficult to potentially put tall buildings, but that's a completely different issue for density. So I mean, we're doing a whole load of work at the moment saying, well, what does happen if you add 2 stories to this area of the city over 50 years? Will it really adversely affect the streetscape and the sense of utility of the place and the quality of the place, so that you can start to put in plans that set a context for height increases, just so long as it doesn't affect the the amenity and the attractiveness of the place. Because it's worth remembering. I think London is successful, and all the places around London, because of its heritage and the quality of place and the quality of experience. So it's just really important that we don't do things that sort of undermine that. We want to do things that enhance the utility of the place and the quality.
It's about learning. Look across the road from your office. All of that great Greycoat estate off Victoria Street is beautiful. It's some of the loveliest residential accommodation in London. It's very dense and it's not tall. Dolphin Square, Barbican. I mean, there are very tall dense, towers in Barbican, but very dense, but not great skyscraping towers.
Well, running on that subject. I mean, if you look at Paris, they built La Défense, we have high-rise in Frankfurt. They've dedicated these entire regions for high density. And I find it somewhat unusual, the fact that here, where there's this constant fight between the private market wanting to build high-rises in the city, when there's the opportunity of devising these such zones to build a high density and protect the urban fabric that is existing. How come there hasn't been any legislative move to create such an environment where you could build your glittering spires outside the city and then protecting the urban qualities and scales of the city itself? Is that also a cultural thing? Because, you know, if the French said it, oh, you know.
No. I think it's a challenge because, you know, you would argue it's the nature of government in London. So there is, you know, there's a regional planning authority, you know, the GLA, who sets the strategic plan, but the strategic plan, you know, are a set of design criteria and a set of numbers. It doesn't really set where the critical growth is going to be or shape the city. And it can't really. And then it falls down to, you know, to local authority areas. There are 32 local authority areas. I mean, no one would, if you were starting again today, you would never create 32 local authority areas in London. But it is impossible to suggest that you shouldn't have 32 local authority areas in London because that's just too difficult a political issue to change. So it's a function of of those two elements, and that's why things like mayoral development corporations are suggested to give impetus in certain areas and bring more public money into those places and help drive them and help set a different planning context. So you know, I do strongly believe that there should be more mayoral development corporations, not too many of them, because if you have too many then you have limited resources, but in some of those areas that can accommodate growth. And I do as well think that you want to make those places, if you go down that route, really, really extra special. You know, so everyone aspires to have one in their area rather than feeling it's a sort of second-class option. And I think we do need to go back to history. So again, we've had the fabulous journey of the early sort of private sector new towns, which were fabulously successful, and then obviously the public sector tried to sort of emulate it in the 50s and 60s and did a bit of a bodge job, and then that sort of sets the characteristic of saying, my God, you know, if we have a new town, is it going to be another equivalent of Telford or something like that? Whereas actually you want it to be something that everyone aspires to go and live in.
Yeah, I think one of the issues we've sort of talked around a bit is, can you do this stuff by taking the politics out of it, you know, sort of saying about zoning, land and things like that. Personally, my view on this is you can't take the politics out of this. This is about people's lives, it's about the places they live. You have to win the argument. That's what we've got to do. And when it comes to things like new garden cities or new towns, when it comes to urban extensions, we have to mobilise the sort of silent majority at the moment who would benefit from that and know they would benefit from that, but aren't motivated to go and support it publicly. One of the big challenges in housing is the people against new housing are really motivated, and they'll go to planning committees and they'll make their case. We have to mobilise people like yourselves, like renters, who are currently don't really have a voice in this debate, but this is your city as much as it is people who already own property here. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Hi. Martyn, I think you mentioned the kind of impossibility of stopping foreign investment into London, which I agree with to a point, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the possibility of a kind of land value tax that might go some way to kind of narrowing the gap between owners and non-owners, because I think we heard last year that the average property increase in value kind of was higher than the average salary in London. So our homes, if we're lucky to own, is actually earning us more than our jobs. So I was wondering what you think about that.
I think that the only way something like added taxes on private development are going to help is that if those taxes directly fuel and fund the provision of more units. The reason that there is so much foreign investment, the reason is there is so much money to be made out of private property development in London, residential property development in London, is because there's not enough. It's a simple supply and demand market forces. The foreign money pouring into London to park itself in residential property is going to slow down when it's not such a rare commodity. And it's not going to be a rare commodity when there is more built and people find it easier to get mortgages and to buy a home. So I'm really, I don't have a lot of clear views about how you do that. I just know that that has to change. You have to find ways of building more property quicker.
Back. A few rows back.
It's quite surprising that London contributes, a major part for the UK's economy, and ironically, it happens to be that you spend only 7% of the stamp duty value into the homes. Rather, the New York spends about 50%, and Tokyo spends about 70% of what it generates from stamp duty into its homes. But more of the money goes outside London and then back to Eurozone, and then you get the money back again, but you don't actually spend more money. And the first presentation was saying that three of those major points were concerning the mayor. So if the mayor is given more power to spend more money into London, I think wouldn't it not make it more easier to build homes much faster than getting money from Eurozone?
Yeah, I think there is a really good case for devolving some of stamp duty to the mayor. The problem with that, though, is that London at the moment is generating so much of the stamp duty property tax take for the UK as a whole. If you gave it all to the mayor, you'd be really starving other parts of the UK of investment. And places like Manchester need transport infrastructure investment too. So I think it's a balanced one. I think some property taxes should be devolved into London, but I'm not really convinced that the whole thing should be, because the vast amounts of wealth that are being generated in London, if you take that away from the rest of the country, it's going to cause huge disruption.
Yeah, but at the same time, when you're proposing mansion tax and choking the throats of the existing people who are living in London, it's going to be even more difficult to provide more services to London, and you're expecting more people to come and then providing less housing, and then even choking the people who are already there. It's worsening the situation even more.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, but I think if we were having this debate in another city in England, they might see things differently. But I think there's also a good case for adding. You mentioned land value tax, adding a couple of bans to council tax for more expensive properties. Council tax at the moment is actually based on property values from the early 1990s. Obviously, properties aren't worth the same as they were in the early 1990s. So people who are living in £1 million houses could be paying a little bit more council tax, and especially if that money's being invested in affordable housing.
Yeah, I think the challenge is on council tax, the funding tends to be spent on council services. But I do think, it's a really interesting point about stamp duty. I can't remember this, I'm probably wrong with the statistics, but I think, there was sort of Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea generate 40% of the stamp duty receipts of the country, in terms of the disposal. So, because, it's just that's where the very, very high value homes are. But we get, I think we did an analysis, and we get virtually no money, no central government money to fund affordable housing. I think we use our own resources and spend maybe about 30 or 40 million a year, and the GLA probably give us, if we're lucky, maybe a couple of £1 million a year. So there is a massive disparity between where the money is raised and where the money is spent. I think the other thing the other big statistic that I always find interesting is London's transport spend per capita is something like £5,000 or £6,000 per capita, and in somewhere like Manchester it's £126 per capita or something like that. So there are areas where we get an enormously good deal, and you do start to wonder whether that balance might need to change in the future.
Just hear this one.
Hello. Yeah, I basically wanted to ask you a very simple question. There was a point about the expansion of London boundaries. My question to you is it easier to handle densities or the sporadic growth of the entire city? That is, I don't think it will ever stop. It's ever-growing cities now, and it's encroaching all the other cities around London. So are we talking about London growing into entire UK, or what is this exactly?
So actually, the green belt around London, we talked about the green belt a little bit. It is more land in the green belt than in London. so it's not really a belt. I mean, imagine if you wore a belt that was bigger than you. That's what London's doing with the green belt. So I think there is some scope for London to expand. I actually think green belts generally are a good thing. They increase density in cities. They mean that we use our land better than, say, American cities that sprawl for miles and miles and struggle to provide services to their citizens. So I think there is a good case for having a green belt. We've just got to relax parts of it around transport hubs in particular, where growth should be happening. And it's been mentioned already, parts of the green belt are they're not attractive. It's brownfield land, it's pony paddocks. There's actually, I think there's over 50 golf courses within the M25. I mean, do we really need 50 golf courses, or could we make do as a city with 30 or something?
It's so politically toxic. That's the problem. It's about beautiful trees and rolling meadows and cows and sheep, and it just isn't.
But I don't think I would say I don't think it's one or the other. It's both. There's no one solution here. It's doing everything all at the same time and keeping pushing on. Keeping pulling all of the levers.
It's also the political power of people who live with a view of the green belt.
Yeah,
that's a very, very, very powerful lobby, particularly for our current mayor.
Any questions over here? Sorry, I haven't been looking your way in the second row.
I suppose everyone in the audience pretty much agrees with the points that you raised, your 5 ideas. What's stopping us? Is it the political powers? It's like an ideological battle. It's something that the architect can prove that we can provide nice homes, but what other power do we have? Most of us here are architecture students, but frankly, maybe our voices would be better heard in a think tank or in some kind of different capacity. I just wondered what our role is and what's...
It always feels to me like design gets lost a bit in that debate. And when there are constraints that are driven by, as I talked about, the tension between private and public sector in delivering affordable housing, you just have a set of constraints, and we all have to try and work within them to make it work. Design has an absolutely incredibly important role to play in making that difficult situation work, because it's the one thing in the middle that everyone's got to deal with and engage with. What are we, of what we can build, what's it going to be like? And we're all engaged in that. And so that issue about density, about what you can say as practitioners of design, what you can say about how to make density work, that's hugely important. What you've got to say about making places beautiful and amazing and inspiring for people to live, that's vitally important. If we're going to live in smaller places, how do we live in smaller places and be really happy in them? How do we build more flats per square acre? You have an enormously important role, and you need to shout from the rooftops about it.
I'd say, it's a really, really interesting point. I think, I do think what's happened over the last few years is housing, the lack of housing has become a more and more and more important issue. So that's good, because we're here today talking about it. And if we weren't here, the whole emphasis of change wouldn't happen. But I do think it's about getting the first thing is getting the narrative right. So, when I'm sort of out talking to residents who are, we're talking about changing estates, the narrative I'm always saying is so where are your kids going to live? Where are your children going to live? And it's a constant discussion, and people go, oh, and you go, but seriously, where are they going to live? If we don't do this, your children, they can't live, they could live in bunk beds in your house, they can't afford to live locally. When you get to old house, where are they going to live? And it becomes, people start to think this is we all have a joint responsibility to try and enable change. I think the second issue is about it's just organisations being confident that they can deliver change. So again, in public sector land, there weren't many organisations doing this maybe 10 years ago, and there's a lot more of them doing it now. And they've got confident now, so the politicians go, actually, our teams can deliver change, and it can work pretty well if we work really, really carefully with the industry to deliver great places. And then I think the future thing is really focusing on the positive, which is about, it's about shaping our future heritage. and what's the input that everyone has into shaping that future heritage, which is both a built heritage and it's a people heritage as well. So we then start to focus on the amenity and the quality of what we're trying to create, as opposed to taking away amenity and quality from something important.
I think that's a really important message, because I think what is needed is some more innovative approaches to housing design, and I think that's where the architecture profession really has a role to play, because it's just making best use of space, it's making density work, it's more sustainable building methods, cheaper building methods. But so I think that there is a very positive way of bringing your knowledge to bear on that. Any other points? Yes, just here.
I have a question. I was very interested in the first graph that you showed about the increasing of number of people and jobs versus the slowest increasing of housing. I was wondering if in this increase, how many people really vote, for example, or are like me, for example, just users of the city. They stay for some years. I have no intention of buying any house in London. I'm just being exploited for my rent. So the job that I get gets drained into the rent, and suddenly the lords or the queen or whoever is happy about that. So it's a system actually through which somehow London sustains itself, and it is growth, and therefore the jobs probably, So in some ways, to make more maybe provocation, of course I'm kind of simplifying, I think the answer of all the points are completely even banal, I would say, in their kind of common sense and how good they are, and the way in which they are not implemented is because actually there is not the interest to implement them. And actually the system works through scarcity, and the scarcity is part of the increasing of the property value, and therefore of the economy, and therefore of the fact that housing probably is not about people at all, but it's mostly about money in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but I'd come back to the points made earlier about how housing is now rising up the political agenda. So the pollsters YouGov do every month, they do a tracker of the biggest issues that British people see in their local area and for the country. And over the last year, housing's been a top 5 issue. It's been over crime, it's been above pensions, it's been above tax. People are getting really concerned about this. And again, it's that point about where are my kids going to live? It's not just generation rent that are worried about this. It's the parents and grandparents of generation rent that, they're the ones that are thinking, am I going to have to give all my savings for my retirement to my kids in order to get on the ladder? Am I going to have to subsidise my kids' rent if they're going to be able to live in Zone 6? That's the kind of... people are getting really concerned about this. It's becoming a major political issue, and that will lead to action eventually. I completely agree, not enough is being done at the moment, but the more people who talk about housing and say it's an issue for them or for their family, politicians are going to eventually listen, because they're voted for by the public, so that's what motivates them.
Any final points? Towards the back. Yes, thank you.
I found it interesting that, related to the topic of density, nobody mentioned the space standards and the very controversial issue of, shall we change the space standards, i.e. reduce them? One could argue on the side of innovation, of how we use space, or is it that no one mentioned them because you all think, in fact, we're in the right place, which would make me happy. But it is one of those debates out there that you can certainly increase the number of units by reducing space standards.
It's an interesting one. It's one that we'll come on to as we go through the series. But any thoughts on that, particularly from the property developer side? What are people looking for?
That only...
Yeah.
You're not constrained by the rules of a box, and you can get 20 flats, and if you make them half the size, you can get 40. In Brighton, again, I'll say that the density of my scheme in Brighton is being affected by somebody who bothers about historic buildings and putting new buildings next to historic buildings, and there's just absolutely no conversation allowed about the fact that those modern buildings might be the buildings that those people fight for in 100 years' time. So they're sort of putting themselves out of business. And And that's the conversation about density that I want to be able to maintain some sense of space standards and produce lovely places where people want to live, but put more of them well designed into a place. It's about putting good flats together well enough, good design again, and making places be inspiring and good and work and effective, but more of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is purely a personal view. I'm not wholly convinced that, you know, a one-size-fits-all space standards is appropriate. But of course, you know, so developers certainly in Westminster, you know, schemes come in with lots of that are non.
Do you apply the
London Design Guide? Not really, because we'd say, you know, it's a question of design and amenity,
And it's
rather than rigidly applying space standards. And it is a bit weird when you think of the stock. I think the issue is you know, the real challenge is so if you're delivering, you know, if a home is being delivered in a suburban area, your amenity requirements, you know, the way that you live is going to be quite different from living in the middle of Soho. And you know, or living right next to Regent's Park or something like that. So there is an issue about understanding the context within which you're designing, and then starting to understand what the amenity requirements are of that building and that place, because of what's in the surrounding area. And secondly, is can some of the amenity that you would generally put into lots of little flats, can't that be grouped together and used in a more creative way? You know, sort of collectively as part of the building. So, I mean, certainly that's a lot of what we're looking at the moment is you know, does it make sense for every one-bedroom flat to be, you know, to be London Design Guide sort of compliant, or should we be looking at some different models for different sorts of schemes in specific places to respond to specific needs? But then you don't want to have, you know, a rash of studio accommodation everywhere, because again that wouldn't meet housing needs. And one of our massive issues is about overcrowding. So we're doing a lot of redevelopment of estates to deliver, you know, larger housing so that people are less overcrowded. So
it depends upon the context and the issues. But I think it comes back to the point that was being made about what the role of the architect is, and that's clearly a role. I'm going to draw things to a close now, because we are going to continue the debate over the next few weeks. I'll just say, has anybody got a burning question that they want to raise with the speakers? This is a burning one here. There we are.
Sorry. I wonder if any of you would be bold enough to make a prediction about what might happen in the next 10 years in London. And it's about the nature of change and whether you think a whole bunch of well-intentioned little people can do little bits of change and tweak the system and make it better, or will it be led by inertia and it won't change radically unless it gets really bad first? So who wants to make a prediction?
Where you'd like to be in 10 years' time?
Wow, I think the norm will be, you know, on the public sector side, a lot of local authorities redeveloping estates and adding density. You know, so I mean, it's happening already, but it will become the new norm. So if you're living in one of those areas, it's not so unusual for that change. And I do wonder whether there will be more significant sort of interventions, so development corporations set up with more funding in certain locations to try and drive supply. But those are the challenges. All of those projects are like, you know, the quickest project takes 10 years, and many of the projects take 20 or 30 years. That's a long time in a political horizon.
Ellen, do you think that we're going to see more self-build?
Yeah, I think so, because I think you know, that's much more normal within in Europe, and I think that's something that people will begin to do more here. I also think that I think the way we see rental will change as well.
To become more the norm.
Become more norm. I wonder if our perception towards having to own a house will completely change, because that isn't, you know, you don't have to own it, you can rent it if it's a more regulated system. Because at the moment you can, you know, I rent a house in Dalston with one window because it's cheap enough for me to live in. So I think if that becomes more regulated, so it's less worrying if you're going to get kicked out or etc., then it might, people wanting to own a house might not become so important.
Private rental sector is a huge growing part of our industry and will really affect the amount of people who have mortgages or who rent. I think the politics of this debate is going to become ever more shrill and ever more important. It's begun already. It's going to be a very big deal in this election. As Pete said, it's going to become an even bigger deal in the mayoral election in London next year. It's going to be a very, very big issue. And a lot of property developers are going to come in for an awful lot of stick. Probably quite rightly, a lot of local authorities are going to come in for an awful lot of stick for not being the other half of the solution. I think that the market's going to go in a cycle, and as it always does, as at the minute property prices are shooting through the roof, before long they're going to fall through the floor. It's how it goes, so whatever happens, it's going to be a rocky ride over the next 10 years.
I think I guess I would say this, but I think it can be solved in the next 10 years. And I think the thing to look at is actually Holland again, because in the early 90s, it's a really similar situation to the southeast of England. It's a really high density country. They had rising house prices, rising housing pressures, and they basically said, we're going to do something about this. We're going to build sustainable urban extensions, new towns. We're going to meet our housing supply challenge. And they took people along with them. They got public support, and they did it within about 10 to 15 years. This is possible to solve. And I guess we've got a choice now over the next 10 years. Do we continue down the road that we've been going on of ever rising house prices, rising rents and rising homelessness, or do we actually start tackling this problem and building the affordable homes that we desperately need?
Well, I think that's a positive note to end on. The debate's going to continue next week, and I think a lot of the points that we've raised tonight about density and about the type of housing feed very well into this, because the topic next week is going to be quantity versus quality. Can we deliver and make great places? And we've got a new set of speakers to again extend the debate and bring some new ideas in. But I'd just like to thank, on your behalf, the speakers tonight, because I think you've actually started to get the debate going really well, and we'll hopefully you'll see in 4 weeks' time, and when we come back to the open jury, when the students will be able to present some of their work, some of those ideas coming through into some solutions. So thank you very much.